Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa usalli wa usallam ala Sayyid al-Awwaleen Akhirin Nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barik wa sallam. All praise are due to Allah, Lord of the worlds, and peace and blessings be upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad, the master of the first and the last, his family, his companions, and all those who call to his way and establish his sunnah to the day of judgment. As to what follows, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, we are continuing in our study of Islam in the West. So this is the movement of Islam out of Mecca from its base, and instead of north or east, this is going to the West. And this really is a subject which is important because it's a change in mindset. So the focal points of Islam, in the heartlands of Islam, people, unfortunately, because of the colonial period, don't have access to information. Even Muslims don't even understand what happened to other Muslims in different parts of the world. So this is a new study in the sense of putting it together, looking at the West, the near West, which was in East Africa, because Mecca and going west, you're in East Africa, the first migration, and then going across North Africa to the west in a sense, and Morocco and Algeria was called by the Muslims Al-Maghrib. And Al-Maghrib means the west. So that's literally how Muslims, geographers and historians looked at that area. We took it further. We went northwest into Al-Andalus, Spain and Portugal. Then we went to the southwest across the desert into West Africa. Then we made a leap, and that was across the Atlantic. So this was the far west. Okay, and we're still going west, and we realize that Muslims actually reached that part of the world before Columbus. And after the time of Columbus and the founding of the United States, Muslims played a very important role and were very much active within the society. Then we looked at the Atlantic slave trade and what happened during that time when people were enslaved coming out of Africa into the Americas. And by that we mean Canada, the United States, Caribbean, Central America, and South America. And you notice I'm saying Canada because some people think there was no slavery in Canada, but that's not true. There were slaves. It is actually reported that some of the enslaved people escaped Canada and went to America. And that's something that most people don't understand. And one of our sisters, Afua Cooper, has written a number of works, concerning what happened in Canada itself. And generally speaking, when people think of slavery, there's two major mistakes when it comes to African people. First is that people associate slavery only with African people. Okay, and secondly, they are told that African people submitted to slavery and they allowed themselves to be in this position. And we have been bringing information to show the opposite. And this is the reason why we need to repeat certain things over and over again, because there's a lot of conditioning that's gone on in our minds. Number one, that slavery itself was a worldwide institution. There were slaves in China, India, in Africa, in the Middle East, so-called Middle East, Europe, slaves in the Americas. And the word slave itself that we're using comes from Slav. So the Slavic people, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people, were enslaved by the Romans. And this is one of the largest amount of slaves, Germanic and Slavic type people. And we're still using the word slave, which actually meant a Slav. And the Slav is a particular ethnic linguistic group. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, right? Slavic, okay? And we're still using it as a slave. And this is how language changes, in the same way that when the Germanic people were conquering Spain many centuries ago, they got resistance from some of the local people in Spain, and they were called Vandals. And the Vandals believed in one God, many of them, and they actually spread into North Africa. But the Romans were so upset with the Vandals that they associated Vandals with thievery and with robbery. So today, in English, although English is changing, but if you were to say, my house was vandalized last night, what does that mean? My house was vandalized? Does anybody know? It was robbed. Now think about this. You're using the name of a people to say that your house was vandalized. In other words, a bunch of vandals came into your house. Okay? So this is how words get misused. And the Slavs, who were the main slaves for the Romans, now the word is being used to mean bondage, this human bondage, the control of one person over another. And slavery takes different forms. Today there's a lot of slavery left. There is economic slavery. And you see people who sell themselves, or they're captured. Like you have, for instance, from Eastern Europe, you have prostitution. And the prostitutes are controlled by their pimps and their hustlers. They control them. They have no control over their life. So in a sense, they're slaves. You have people who work in sweatshops who come and they give their life to the factory. So there are forms of slavery that still exist up until today. But to look at slavery historically, and again, in this picture you can see these are Chinese-type slaves, Mongolian. Slavery was generally brought about through kidnapping, where you raid a village, or you raid somebody, you kidnap them. Or it could be debts. People had to pay their debt, so they would sell their children. They would give their children to pay the debt. Or just sell the children anyway because they're hungry. And then punishments. Slavery was also a punishment because in many cases it's better to work to use the person as a worker than just killing them. And lineage, if you were born in a family, of slaves, you could also be a slave in some societies. And especially warfare. So this is mainly how it came, as prisoners of war. And this happened all over the world. And surprisingly enough, even here in the Americas. Okay? So we are looking at the Atlantic slave trade. So this is where Europe, and especially it was Portugal and Spain that first came out. And you ask yourself why? And that is because the Spanish and then the Portuguese, they took over Andalusia from the Muslims. It was surrendered in 1492. So they were really the first European country to have access to technology and to wealth that could enable them to cross the seas. And so you will see in terms of the slave trade, it's like a triangle. So you have Europe, and then you go down to West Africa, and then you go to the Americas, and then back to Europe. So it's like a triangle that was happening. And people would say, what is it that inspired the Portuguese to get involved in slavery? Because if you look at Portugal itself, it's not a huge country. And it doesn't necessarily have some special technologies, but what inspired them? And there were 4 reasons, from the main reasons that historians would say. Number 1, they saw enslaving people in Africa and then going to the Americas and enslaving the people and conquering, they saw it as part of the Crusades, because they were fighting the Crusades mainly against Muslims and other peoples in the so-called Middle East. That's the famous Crusades. But there was also a crusade that went from Spain, went from Germany and France into Spain. So that was another section of the Crusades. So when they were able to conquer Portugal and Spain, they saw the rest of the world as part of the Crusades, because they knew that Muslims were all over the world. And so the Portuguese in particular had hatred for Muslims and fear. And some people will say, well, like, why? What is it that's so terrible about Muslims? Because if you really look at Islam, it's the closest religion to Christianity. We believe that Jesus was born without a father, that Mary was a virgin. May Allah be pleased with them. In terms of our fasting and our prayers and whatnot, we're very similar. We're the closest to Christianity. But for Europe, coming out of its dark ages, when the lights went out, Rome was gone, and the monks in their monasteries, they controlled, the wealth. The Muslim world was leading the whole planet. And so they saw with the Muslims this huge society. So they became paranoid of Muslims. Because when you looked at technology, just about all the areas of technology that were reaching Europe was coming through Muslim hands. Because they didn't have access to India or China. There was a lot of technology in China especially. But by the time it reached Europe, it had to go through the Muslim lands. And then the Muslims were making their own experiments and discoveries. Okay? So, number one, civilization. Two, military. Because Muslims were actually taking back or taking some of the lands of the Romans. They took North Africa, and then later on with the Ottoman Turks, they began to take Eastern Europe away from the Trinitarians. And so there was a paranoia about Islam, which turned into a religious zeal in the 11th century when Pope Urban in Clermont, France, declared crusades. And he declared that anybody who fights for the crusades and dies, you go to paradise. And their basic anthem was, God wills it. God wills it. They kept saying this over and over again. Okay? So that was the first motivator for the Portuguese. The second was their desire for Guinea gold. And when we say Guinea, it's West Africa. And we learned about Mansa Musa, the Malians, and they had the largest, most active gold mine in the world at the time. So the Guinea gold, that is the type of alloy of gold, they thirsted for this, because gold, in a sense, is power. You can buy technology, land, whatever. The third is a mythical, they were looking for this mythical king or potentate called Prester John. And Prester he's like a priest. But they believed that there was a Christian king that went to the east and had a society, and he had immense power. And so they were trying to meet this king and find out where his place was. Many thought that his land was in Central Asia. Okay, and this is not so well known to average people, but it was a big thing in their mind. So that's why they are sailing around the Cape of Good Hope, right, South Africa, and why they're going into the Americas. They wanted to find Prester John. And the fourth is Oriental spices, because Oriental spices was a big part of the civilization. The food in Europe at that time basically did not have spice. The Romans, to a certain extent, because they're Mediterranean, but the Romans were down now. So the food was just like you take your meat and you just burn it and then you eat it, no spice, salt. They basically had. So when they went to the Middle East and they started tasting spice, and then when the spices of India came, now they're tasting things, food tasted totally different. And that's the reason why up until today, you go to England, and they did a census a couple of years ago, and they said, what is the most popular food in London, England? And it was butter chicken, right? It used to be fish and chips, right? Like if you know British culture, you got to have fish and chips. Okay, but no, now it's butter chicken. Even the British themselves, they want their butter chicken. Why? Spice. You see? It's a big part of civilization. And so they were searching for this. And spice, you can get rich with spice because you can carry it long distances as long as you keep it dry. It'll last. You can take it around the world. And it's still in a form that you can sell. You see? So this is a, get rich quick type of policy that they had, which gave them motivation to come out. Also, another important point is that for the Spanish themselves, and when they took over Granada, Christopher Columbus, he was in the area. Some say he was at the doorway, after that, Granada was surrendered to Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish. Columbus then came. And one oath that he made to the Spanish monarchs was that the profits for his voyage across the sea would go towards the recapture of Jerusalem from the Saracens. And they use this word Saracen, which comes from Arabic sharqiyun. Sharq in Arabic means east. So it's like sharqiyun, Saracen, the Easterners, or the Muslims. So Columbus, you think, Columbus, 1492, Columbus sailed, the ocean blue, and he was just innocent, explorer. No, this man was a conqueror, and ultimately he was a crusader, and he was an Islamophobe, a hater of Islam as well. So these are motivations. These are serious motivations that propelled the people. So therefore, now when we look at Africa itself, and again, what is misunderstood about slavery in Africa is that African people submitted to slavery, and we're going to show they did not submit. And secondly, the way it is projected today, especially with the new Islamophobia, which is spreading around the world, is that basically it's Arabs were the biggest slave traders in the world, and the Arabs captured the Africans and then sold them to the Europeans. Okay, and you'll see this up until now in the media, Arab slave trade, Arabs. Okay, this is a total fabrication because number one, in West Africa, there were no Arabs in West Africa. There's some in Mauritania, maybe, not a significant population. The population is mainly like Berber and African, West African. So there were no Arabs down in West Africa who were selling slaves to the Europeans. Arabs who were not practicing Islam, they did have slaves, okay, like the rest of the world, but it was not the numbers that they're trying to project today. Okay, so this idea of Arabs in West Africa selling slaves to the Europeans, this is wrong. What did happen, however, is that many of the kings in West Africa, and you'll see in Dahomey and Ghana and different areas, prisoners of war. So the prisoners of war, when the Europeans now, the Portuguese and then the Spanish, when they reached the coastline and they had goods, firearms, and they had different items that the West Africans wanted. So they said, give us your prisoners. So at that time, it was not, slave was not being used. They would say, give us your prisoners of war. Okay, and so they would take the prisoners of war, trade, and then, take it to their colonies overseas, or they take it back up to Portugal and Spain. And they used the islands off the coast of Senegal, the Cape Verdes, the Azores and Cape Verde Islands, that was a base for the Portuguese because they set up colonies there. They start growing, sugar and cotton and things there. They used it as a staging point for going into the Americas, how to set up a colony. So they did it there, and then they took that overseas. And the Portuguese themselves, they made a deal with the Spanish. They said, give us Brazil. That's all we want. You can take the rest. Because Brazil really is the most fertile place and the biggest area in the Americas. And so the Portuguese took that. The point I'm making here is that when you really look objectively at West African sources, you find that, especially amongst the Muslims, there was resistance to slavery. The people did not necessarily want the Europeans to be taking people away. They didn't realize what was going on. Because for them, slavery, a person could become a slave and then integrate into the society and then actually become wealthy. And that's the way it was in many parts of the world. But the slavery in the Americas is totally different. You are being used like an animal, worse. Just used for your labor and then thrown away. They didn't realize that. But because of Islam and the basic teachings of Islam against, slavery itself, we have some proofs, especially the Imam, they called him Al-Mami, Abdul Qadir Khan, the Futa Toro, and this is the area of Guinea and Senegal and this area in West Africa, right? He was a teacher of the Quran and Maliki jurisprudence, fiqh. He's from a village called Bundu, right, in the Futa Toro area, okay? So he led a major rebellion against the colonial rule. Now, this was not known 10 years ago, even 10 years ago. Even in historical circles, nobody talked about this. And if you said that Muslims resisted slavery, they would say, what's your proof? But a work was done, and if you have a chance to get this book, The Walking Quran, done by Rudolph T. Ware, right, or Butch Ware he's known as. This book you can get online. Excellent book. And he brings the proof, right? And he shows how a major rebellion, against colonial rule happened in 1776, and it formed an anti-slavery movement. This is long before the abolitionists in Europe and America. It's interesting, 1776, it's like America too, right? Okay, so at the same time as the rebellion is going on in America against the British, there was a rebellion going on, against the colonial rule in West Africa itself. And the British governor of Senegal, but this is in 1811, he said it may be necessary to remark that there has been greater facility in negotiating with Al-Mami or Imam Abdul Qadir, and less probability of again having disputes with him in consequence of the abolition of the slave trade, a commerce which the Prince Abdul Qadir always opposed as being contrary to the laws of his religion and means through which several of his subjects, followers of the Prophet, were led into captivity. So this is a very important quote because this is showing an African Muslim leader, right, who is against slavery based on his religion. Okay, that's totally against the Islamophobic thing that Muslims are slave traders. Arabs went into Africa, to steal, the African people. And this quote is not a Muslim. It's the British governor who's saying this. So he's saying if you want to deal with abolition, stop slavery, this Muslim leader, is better than anybody else. And it's according to his religion. Okay? And is also said by the French governor in Senegal, nothing could take away from these Fullahs, meaning Fulani or the Fullah people, the idea that in forbidding the trade in slaves, the Europeans were emboldened by their example. So it's their example. Okay, and then he says they are proud to have bypassed us in the progress of reason, justice, and humanity. This is the French governor in Senegal saying these African Muslims were actually, they were better than us, when it comes to stopping the slave trade. Because at one point, after 300 years, many Europeans said, no, this is wrong. Some said, the leaders, they said for economic reasons. And we're going to see why they had to stop. But others, their conscience, they said, this is too much. How can we continue to be doing this? This was already being done by the Muslims. So getting back to the Americas now, in the colonies themselves, the first slaves, so when the Portuguese come, the Spanish come, and then the British, the French, but especially in America, right? This is the British, the French. The first people who they actually took as slaves were the native Indian populations, okay, the First Nations. But that didn't work because this was their land. And they would just sit down and not work, like go on strike, right? And then if they got a chance, they run away. And when they go into the forest, you can't catch them because that's their land. So they said, okay, it's a waste of time to enslave the native people. It's not economically feasible. Then they said, let's try poor whites. And it was I ran across an article recently to show that there were actually, thousands of Irish people who were actually brought into America first as slaves. Okay, so you might use the term that they're indentured laborers, but it's actually a form of slavery because the Irish were looked down upon, in the British realms. So they were brought in as slaves, but that didn't work either because they were white too, like the master. And so there was still some chance for mobility. So that didn't work. So now they were looking for somebody who is easy to identify and also who has skills for their mainly tropical colonies. Because you're talking about Brazil, Caribbean, southern part of the United States. This is where most of their plantations were. Okay? And Africa was perfect. So this shows you some of the ports of call, and this is the trade between 1500 to 1870 is when this happened. So this is like the ports of call, and you can see where the people are being enslaved and taken into the Americas. You see Brazil too. You see the size of Brazil. This is the major place. So all types of nations were carried across. And this is interesting because, again, there is Muslims involved in this. Okay, and along with the other nations, the Ashantis, the Wolof, the Coromantee, Igbos, Yoruba, Mandinka, everybody put together. Anyone they could capture, they would take across. But there was resistance. There was resistance on the shores. There was resistance on the boats. So people would jump off the boat or people would fight against the sailors on the boat. This is what is called the Middle Passage. Okay, and thousands of people lost their lives on this Middle Passage in between Africa and the Americas. Okay? And the point, again, which I'm emphasizing, because this is a big challenge. I mean, in 20, 30 years ago, even in academia, they would not allow you to say this. They would drum you out. They would kick you out of the university, or they would ask you for your proof. But now it's recognized that between 15 to 30%, and someplace more, of African enslaved people, political prisoners, were Muslims. So from about 12 to 15 million people approximately taken across in slavery, right, about 1 in every 3 was Muslim. And that was not known before. People thought that all of the enslaved people were Ashanti, Yoruba. They were not Muslims. Muslims are the Arabs, right? You're the slave traders. But that's a total misnomer because it was the kings. It was Dahomey and other Ashanti. These are not Muslims, not Arabs, African kings who sold their prisoners of war. And it became a lucrative trade. Okay, but we're establishing here again, for those who are not aware of this thing, that 1 in every 3. Okay, so resistance. We're focusing on resistance to the European slavery now. Because European slavery was based upon kidnapping and purchase. Forget about all the other things, debt, child selling, no, forget all that. It's basically they kidnap you or they buy you. Okay? And then, by the 16th century, color became very, very serious. And they had what is called the Code Noir, the black codes, where anybody of African descent, you're immediately a slave. And once you get in slavery, it's almost impossible to come out. Okay, upward mobility, forget it. There's no upward mobility. The best you could be is to work inside of the house and, instead of the field, but no upward mobility. So what was the resistance? There's 3 major forms of this resistance that happened. One is what is called fugitive slave settlements. Okay, and these were called maroons. So you'll see the word maroon settlements. Quilombos in Portuguese. That's what they call them in Brazil. So this is the first. Now, where the word maroons comes from, it probably came out of Jamaica, because Jamaica is where some of the first maroon colonies were, because the Jamaicans there was really rebellious. It's probably the most rebellious place in the whole region. And so they would literally, as soon as they got a chance, they run into the interior of Jamaica. And the difference between Jamaica and a place like Barbados and some of the other islands is there's a lot of mountains and valleys. So it's easy to escape and to make a settlement. And so the Spanish called them cimarrones. And cimarrones is like a wild horse. So you say, look at these cimarrones. So they became maroons. Okay, so this is where the word, this maroon settlement is coming from. 2, if they couldn't escape and make these settlements, they would attempt to seize power from the white plantation owners themselves. So in other words, they would just attack the settlements and try to seize power. So this is another way a lot of the rebellions took place. And you'll see this all over one of these 3 types usually. The third is literally an armed insurrection. An armed insurrection takes organization. So the second one can be spontaneous or just a small group. Armed insurrection requires organization and leadership. So it's these 3 that we want to look at. This is a big subject, but this will give you an opening. Very interesting subject. And some years ago, it was back in the 80s, actually, I was in the Islam and Africa conference in Abuja, Nigeria. And I had a display, on African Muslims in slavery. And some of the scholars, some of the people from this, it was a huge conference, African Muslim scholars from all over the continent were there. And I remember one scholar, Sheikh Ibrahim Saleh, who is one of the greatest scholars today on the African continent. And he lives in a place called Maiduguri in Bornu. This is northeast Nigeria. And he's a scholar who's recognized all over the Muslim world. And he came by my display. And he looked, and I was showing the documents of Al-Mas'udi, Al-Idrisi, right? These are the Muslim scholars who spoke about the journeys before Columbus. And he said that, mashallah, I actually read some of these things. But we didn't know what happened to the people after they went overseas. We actually read these reports before, Al-Idrisi's report. But what happened to them? Now you're showing us what actually happened to our brothers and sisters when they actually went across. And this is deep because, again, Islam in the West, this is the West now. Muslims were busy in the West. And that's what the rest of the Muslim world don't realize, how busy Muslims were in this part of the world. They were not just a few people who were enslaved and laid down and died. No, they were busy. All types of things were happening. And it's like the tip of the iceberg. And we're opening this up for you, looking at Islam in the West. So, looking at some of the documents that we have, the first rebellions, and this is, remember the Portuguese, right? So the first rebellions was the Senengambians, Ladinos, Bozales, right? They were the first Africans to be sold in the so-called New World by the Portuguese. Okay, they made rebellions. In 1522, the Wolof of Hispaniola. Hispaniola is Dominican Republic and Haiti, right? That island. So 1522, rebellion. This is probably the first African, recorded African slave revolt. That happened there. The Wolof, if you know the Wolof people, they're Senegalese. The majority of Senegalese are Wolof. And they're very proud and strong people. If you know West African culture, Wolof. So Wolof are serious. So once the Wolof hit the shore, rebellion took place. To the point where the Portuguese leaders, Philip and them, they said, don't take any more Muslims as slaves because it's too much trouble. They actually have documents with this. Take non-Muslims because they're making rebellion. They rebelled in Puerto Rico. They rebelled in Panama. Right? So these are some of the first rebellions. 1522 I'm talking about. That's just after Columbus, right? Who bumped into America in 1492. That's like 30 years later. And Muslims are already making a rebellion there. Okay? Now, this is new information. And I'm going to bring you the source of this information at the end. These are some of the areas where these Maroon revolts were taking, these settlements and these sometimes spontaneous revolts. And Muslims were involved in these. Now we have some documentation for this. In Mexico in 1523, rebellion. Muslims were involved in the leadership. Cuba, 1529. In Panama, 1550 to 1582. In Venezuela, 1550. Right? In Peru, 1560. Think about these countries. You're seeing these countries in the news now, right? Venezuela, right? There's a big black population in Venezuela on the coast. Guatemala, 1627. Chile, 1647. Martinique, that's an island in the Eastern Caribbean, 1650. And in Florida, right, 1830 to 1840. Now, there's other information, too, about some of the other rebellions in the United States. But in terms of clear understanding of Muslim presence, this is what we're talking. We're not talking about rebellions. There's hundreds of rebellions. But where Muslims were involved. Okay, and this is groundbreaking information that is now coming out. So, the Maroon resistance. Maroon resistance. Now, this is the island of Jamaica, which is close to me. My wife is from Jamaica, although she was raised in Canada. And I lived in Jamaica for 4 years and went all over the island and, very familiar with Jamaica. But, the Maroon areas, the Maroons were so effective that they escaped, especially to these areas that you see here. Maroon Town was on your left, Cockpit, Accompong area, and I've been up in Accompong and met the Maroons. And then on the other side of the island, also, you have a Maroon settlement. They were so effective that they took the area and they defeated the Spanish. They defeated the British. Nobody could defeat them. And so the British made treaties with them. And up until now, they have a separate law and treaty than the Jamaican government. They were never defeated. The most the British were able to do was to turn them against some of the other slaves, to make a treaty that if somebody escapes, and is not already in your colony, you have to send them back, things like that. These type of things were made, but this is Maroon resistance, and this is the most powerful. And in this, there's two famous people in the Maroon resistance. One is Nanny of the Maroons, a Jamaican hero, and the other is Sam Sharp, Okay, and so this is 1673 to 1740. And his rebellion, Sam Sharp's rebellion, was defeated. He was defeated and captured, and he died. He was hanged. But his final words were, "I would rather die upon yonder, up there, right, up on those gallows, than live in slavery." These are his words. Okay, and that's Sam Sharp. These are national heroes in Jamaica today. Okay, and this is part of the Maroon Rebellion. And I had the chance to go up into the Maroon areas. And they actually have, especially in the Accompong area, there's a place. It's a big hole, like. It's called Juma Pit, the Juma area. And there's a huge area, like a pond, that's there. And they still call it the Juma area because the Muslims would make their Friday prayers in this area. And Qurans were found, some Quranic writing was found up in the area. Okay, so the second major Maroon rebellion, 1795, Trelawney Maroons, they rebelled, and they fought the British to a standoff. So there was a truce signed, but the Maroons were tricked. Some of them were tricked here, and they were sent to Nova Scotia. So look at the connection with Canada. These are Jamaican Maroons sent to Nova Scotia, and then many of them left Nova Scotia and they went to Sierra Leone, because Sierra Leone was opening up as a free colony, Liberia and Sierra Leone. So they actually went to Sierra Leone from Canada. Okay, and that's part of our history in terms of the Maroon rebellions. Another important rebellion was the Bush Blacks of Suriname. Now, Suriname is Dutch Guyana. When you look at the map of South America, you'll see the Guyanas. There's British Guyana, right, which is now called Guyana, right? Then there's French Guyana, and then there is Dutch. There's Dutch Guyana. So there's three of them. Okay, so Suriname is the Dutch Guyana, and there was a major rebellions happened there, and one of the big rebellions in 1757, the leader of the rebellion was called Arabi, and his general was called Zamzam, like Zamzam water from Mecca. He was the general. This is a recorded thing, and they went into the interior, defeated the Dutch, and they had their own settlement. Up until today, there are Maroon settlements in Suriname. And I had the honor, being in Guyana, and, they came to our conference. They came from the area. Many of them are accepting Islam now from the Maroon, areas there in Suriname. Okay, so this is another interesting one to look up. Another revolt to look at, and this one, was originally a revolt, but then it turned into what you could call armed insurrection. Okay, but the revolt itself, just taking over the white plantation, was led by Francois Macandal, who was born in Guinea, right, West Africa, and then another person named Bookman. He was enslaved in Jamaica and then went over to Haiti, and they were both known as Marabout. So the Marabout is Morabit. They are like an itinerant scholar who travels around. They led slave revolts on the plantations. So these things spread all on the plantations, and then a great general, Haitian general named Toussaint Louverture, he organized the rebellions. It turned into an armed insurrection. They defeated the French. And this was the first major victory against the colonial powers. And the Haitians are paying for this up until today, because the French blockaded them, Americans blockaded them. They're still suffering because of their rebelliousness. But alhamdulillah, now there are masjids opening up. This is not so well known, but there's Muslims now. Islam is spreading in Haiti now. Okay, so this is the Haitian rebellion. In Guyana itself, British Guyana, there are some major rebellions, one called the Berbice Rebellion in 1763, right? And this was led by Kofi. This is a big one here, very important for Guyanese people. He's a national hero. And there's some documentation to show that when Kofi was making he made a treaty with the British, I believe at the time. He made a treaty, and the writing that was being used was Arabic script. So either Kofi himself or his scribe was a Muslim. Okay, this is the Berbice Rebellion. There was another revolt in 1823, Demerara, if you know the Demerara River. This was in 1823. So I'm giving you, this is a way you can research this. And you can see this is Muslims in the West, busy, right? Busy holding on to their faith and fighting back. The Jamaican Rebellion. Okay, and this one is in 1831 to 1832. Now, in Jamaica, now records are coming to show for 180 years of slavery, Jamaica, they had rebellions almost every decade, all over the place. But the major war that came about, that turned into an armed insurrection, this is what is called the Baptiste War, or sometimes called the 1832 Jihad. Right? This was the largest. And think about this. There was around 60,000 enslaved people were involved in this. 60,000 people, right? So this was major rebellion that happened. And one of the key factors in the rebellion, which many historians are now debating and looking at, was a document that was being passed around amongst the enslaved people called Wathiqa. And it was written in Arabic. Now, what the connection is that right around this time, 1831, this is just after the major jihad of Sheikh Uthman Danfodio of Sokoto in West Africa. Okay, it's 1804 that he started his jihad. And he wrote a document which is like his Declaration of Independence, and this is called Wathiqa Ibn Fudi ila Ahl Sudan. So it is the document, the manifesto of Ibn Fudi, Danfodio, to the people of the Sudan, meaning Black Africa. This is a Declaration of Independence, and it's talking about resistance to the oppressor. Okay, so this, we're trying to get connection. That the problem is that the British, there was a British magistrate who was sent down when they wanted to abolish slavery. Because you see, after these rebellions, they start thinking about abolition. We got to stop this. It's just not going to work. And so one of the British magistrates, Robert Madden, he went there to Jamaica just after this, around this time, to make abolition. And he had been in Syria before. He could speak some Arabic. And he went amongst some of the so-called slaves who they were liberating now from slavery with abolition. And they were speaking Arabic. And so he said something to them in Arabic. He said, like, La ilaha illallah, he said to them. And then he turned around and they all started talking and told him, be quiet. Who are you? Because they were supposed to be Christians. And they said they had scholarly circles in Kingston, Jamaica, and they were writing it to the countryside in Arabic. That's how they would communicate. This is in Jamaica. Okay? And this Wathiqa, we believe, is one of the documents. You have Muhammad Kaaba, right? And then Abu Bakr Siddiq. We have the writings of these people. But, when the rebellion took place, it is said that his wife, she had a copy of this Wathiqa and she destroyed it. Because anybody found with this Wathiqa will be put to death. There are some people who claim it may be in a British museum, but we're trying to find this Wathiqa to connect the two. But in any event, Jamaican Rebellion, 1831. Major. Probably the greatest rebellions of all was in Brazil, because the slave population there was the largest. And also what was different is that there were so many West African slaves taken there that they actually formed collectives. So unlike the other areas where the slaves never had their own villages, there in Brazil, they were actually allowed in certain places to have communities. So from the Yoruba and the Hausa, the West African Nigerians especially, they formed their own communities, and there's literally documentation to show that they had Quran schools, they were teaching, Islamic studies, they had an emir, they had a leader, they had shura, a council. So they literally were organized. And when the big rebellion took place in Bahia in 1835, it was major. And it was so, intense that the Portuguese even allowed many of the Malay, people to return to Africa. So in other words, they said, take the boats, go home. Like, this is too much. And I was in Lagos, Nigeria, and I visited the Oba. The Oba is the leading religious figure amongst the Yoruba religion. So I visited the Oba, and the reason why I did that is because the Oba was a Muslim at the time. And a lot of the Yorubas are actually Muslims, and they integrate. So at this time, he was a Muslim, okay? And I talked to him about the rebellion, and he said, oh, yes. And he pointed to a masjid in Lagos, which is Brazilian mosque. So it was actually built by Brazilian enslaved people who returned, and they know, and everybody knows about them there. So these major rebellions, were taking place, and this is resistance that took place, there in the Americas. So because of this, abolition comes. So this abolition to end slavery is not just done out of the kindness of the Europeans' hearts. No. This was not working out. They were afraid for their lives. And they needed a way to still produce sugarcane, to produce and not have to deal with these revolutions. Okay? So now abolition starts coming about, and we will look at some of the results of the abolition in later classes, inshallah. So I want to open the floor for any questions that anybody may have concerning resistance to slavery in the Americas. Okay? Floor is open for any questions or comments. Go ahead. Yeah.
This image on screen here,
Yeah.
where is this from?
Okay, this one would be from the United States, anti-slavery meetings. I just put this one in there. I'm not actually sure where it is from. Yeah, probably from the United States. Yeah. Yeah. Anything online? Anybody had any questions or comments online? Yeah, so the natural question is, after all this that I've given to you, right, where can we find the information? Right, because having a lecture is not enough if you're a serious student. Okay, so where can we find the information? And there are two books. Okay, one, which is recently launched in London. It was just last week. And alhamdulillah, I was asked to be a respondent in this by Zoom into London. And the author of the book, Dawood Abdullah, he's from Grenada. He's a well-known Muslim in London. He was the Secretary General, of the Muslim Council of Britain for a number of years. And so he has launched a book called Islam, Race, and Rebellion in the Americas. Transatlantic Echoes of the West African Jihads. Okay, so that's his name, Dawood Abdullah. Take a picture of this. If you can, write it down. You can get this online, right? Excellent book, bringing, solid information there. The other book is my own book, if you want quick access to this information, which is called Deeper Roots, right? Muslims in the Americas and the Caribbean from before Columbus to the present. Okay, so this is a new edition of the Deeper Roots. The that talks about even before Columbus, that discussion, and then, there's a slavery period. And you can get that at my website, which is hakimquick.ca, right? Not .com, .ca, hakimquick.ca. So you can get this online there, and it will be sent to you in the mail, inshallah. So with these two books, you will have not only information at your fingertips, but you have sources. And this is crucial. These books are packed with sources. So you can literally, study it, take it further, understand it even deeper with these two texts. Any other question online?
Was there resistance in Puerto Rico with the indigenous people and slave resistance?
Yes, so in Puerto Rico, the resistance we're talking about was in the early time. That's when the Portuguese came in. So the Portuguese they first tried to enslave the Taíno people. So Taínos are the natives, right, of Puerto Rico. They tried to enslave them. That wasn't working out so well. And they were trying to get gold out of the people. They ended up, unfortunately, exterminating a lot of the Taínos and Lucayans who were living in the Bahamas and living in those areas there. And so, for them, they wanted to bring in, black Africans. For them it was easy because the people were not in their home country and, whatnot. So, this is the rebellions that happened. But this is in the early phases. Okay, later on when you see resistance struggles, it would involve the native, Taíno population. Because the Puerto Rican people are basically Taíno people. They're native indigenous people. Okay, floor is open for any other general questions anybody has.
Can we say that modern day slavery
Is like labor camps? It depends upon where it is. But if the labor camp, if people are put into these labor camps and they have no control over their own lives, and they're working, then in a sense it is like modern day slavery. I remember, some years ago, I was doing some teaching, in the United States, and so they invited me into one of the prisons. It was in Baltimore, and I went inside the prison, and I was given some lessons to the Muslims that were incarcerated, and what I found out is that they were working. They were like making Nike Air shoes, and they were literally working for major companies while they were inside, and they were giving them 25 cents an hour or something like that. So literally, if you think about this, and at that time in America, from back in the 80s and 90s, they had this, stop and frisk, and, they would put people in jail. And if you had 3 felonies, if you were found guilty 3 times, you could get life in prison. So if you're doing life in prison, which means at least you're going to do 20 years, you might get back out. But if you're in prison for 20 years or life, and you're working for somebody making running shoes and making, jeans, you're a slave. That's literally a plantation because you have cheap labor. You can't go anywhere. They control your food. They control your life. And they are making 1,000% profit. So in a sense, it is a modern form of slavery that was going on. So alhamdulillah, this is another stage of Muslims in the West, and we see the resistance, and we want to now, there's some other very interesting things that happened in the West, especially with the abolition of slavery that came about, and inshallah, in next week's class we'll be looking at that, and more experiences of Muslims in the West that's not so familiar to Muslims in other parts of the world. So I leave you with these thoughts, and I ask Allah to have mercy on me and you. Wa akhira da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.